Hello, my name is Kim Eagle for ACC.org, and we're here at day 3 of the American Heart Association meetings talking about the major trials being presented here today. I'm joined by Payal Kohli from Denver and Deepak Bhatt from Boston, Massachusetts. The 4 trials that we picked today, one of them deals with atrial fibrillation, and the other 3 are very interesting trials looking at hypertension. So let's start with the ENHANCE-AF trial. Payal, take it away.
Shared decision making has become such an important part of our clinical care that I really like the fact that this trial was a randomized trial of a shared decision making tool to really help us understand how shared decision making can impact clinical care. So one of the most complicated decisions that we make with our patients is starting oral anticoagulation for atrial fibrillation. So in this trial, participants were randomized to the usual standard of care or to a shared decision making pathway where they saw a digital tool that helped them understand, what the risk of thromboembolism is, what atrial fibrillation is, and then of course what the risk of anticoagulation is through videos, as well as multilingual tools, so English and Spanish tools to help understand that. And then what the investigators did is they looked at the primary outcome, which was a month later, basically an outcome called the decisional conflict scale, meaning how easy was it for the patient to make a decision based on this. And what they found was there was, dramatic improvement in the decisional conflict scale. So it really helped enhance the patient's knowledge of AFib and also helped them feel more comfortable making this decision. And they continued to follow these patients out, looking even farther out, and the benefits appeared to be lasting. So really, it's shown for the first time ever that a shared decision-making tool can impact patient care. We have other evidence that shared decision-making makes patients happier, it makes providers happier, and can improve patient outcomes. So I think, when it comes to all the complex decisions we make in cardiology about revascularization, about aspirin, about statins, about oral anticoagulation, I hope we have more of these types of tools moving forward.
Yeah, I really love the toolkit in this trial, the 5-minute video and the sort of teach back moments to make sure that the patient and family was understanding. And this, I think, can be a model for other complex decisions that we make in cardiovascular medicine. So the trialists should be commended for it. We're excited when new drugs become available for old and tough diseases like hypertension. The next 2 studies look at this in new ways. And Deepak, tell us about this interesting trial called Precision.
Yeah, absolutely. It is really interesting. It studied a dual endothelin receptor antagonist. The name of the drug is aprocitentan. And the population, as you alluded to, is hypertension, specifically resistant hypertension, meaning uncontrolled office blood pressure despite 3 or more antihypertensive medications. So that's the type of patients that were enrolled into this trial. And what was found, I think, was really great results with a significant reduction in their blood pressure. They also did ambulatory blood pressure here. That as well looked really good. And overall, the drug seemed pretty safe. There was an increase in edema and fluid retention. That was the most common adverse event that was reported. But I think a real win in resistant hypertension and potentially a new therapy for patients with resistant hypertension and, I think possibly even adjacent conditions like just out of control hypertension, even if it doesn't meet that really strict definition of resistant hypertension.
Yeah, we know that we have so many of these patients that just are so tough to control, even with 4 or 5 classes. It's great to see the potential for a new type of drug coming into the marketplace and the treatment algorithm. The next trial also, I think, looks at an interesting compound. This trial is called Bright Hypertension. Payal, tell us about it.
Primary aldosteronism is one of the most common mechanisms of resistant hypertension. And as you and Deepak have just been talking about, it's such a challenge in some of these patients that are on 3 or more medications and continue to have uncontrolled blood pressures. So we know that aldosterone is involved in raising their blood pressure. In the past, when we've tried to inhibit aldosterone, one of the challenges we've had is that it shares 93% of its sequence, the enzyme that makes aldosterone, with the cortisol synthesis pathway. So we end up having off-target effects on cortisol and other off-target effects as well. So this trial looks at baxdrostat, which is a highly selective once daily small molecule inhibitor that's very selective for aldosterone synthase, and it doesn't seem to affect cortisol. And it really looks to see whether that can affect the treatment of resistant hypertension. And again, very positive, very interesting results here. What we saw was a dose-dependent decrease in systolic blood pressure, ranging from 8 to 11 points after placebo correction. We also saw a decrease in diastolic blood pressure of 5 millimeters of mercury at the highest dose. And we saw that nearly half, 46% of the patients who had resistant hypertension coming into this trial actually had their blood pressure controlled. And many of these blood pressure changes correlated, with decrease in plasma aldosterone and compensatory increases in plasma renin. Now, the drug was very safe. There were no deaths during the trial, had a good safety profile. And in fact, most of the adverse events that occurred during the trial were deemed to be unrelated to the study drug at all. So I feel like this, along with the drug Deepak just talked about, is tools in our toolbox for these, 15 million adults that are walking around with uncontrolled hypertension. And we know that we haven't inhibited the hypertension pathway through all the different mechanisms. Looking forward, though, I hope to even see this type of drug studied in other conditions such as heart failure, where we know that excess aldosterone can contribute to adverse outcomes as well.
Yeah, it comes to mind the fibrosis effects, perhaps, of these types of agents and diastolic heart failure. For tough hypertension, I've always reached for spironolactone or eplerenone, and now we have another class in the general neighborhood as those that might be even better. So it's exciting times for the management of hypertension, and that leads us to the last trial we wanted to cover today, which is also looking at a novel therapy for tough hypertension. This is the Spiral Hypertension On trial. Deepak, tell us about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a trial of renal artery denervation, catheter-based approach for patients with hypertension. And the prior two trials were dealing with resistant hypertension. Here, it's hypertension that's not optimally controlled, but the patients are on medications. So it's a little bit different in terms of the population, but they don't have to be maxed out on medication. So the randomization was to sham control or renal denervation. There was a pilot phase, there was an expansion phase. And in terms of the overall results, first, I think before talking about the blood pressure, the primary endpoint was ambulatory blood pressure. It's important to note there was a significant reduction in the sham control trial in the number of medications with renal denervation and specifically with the medication burden. So that was a significant difference that was seen at 3 months, that was seen at 6 months. So in the sham control trial, I think that's a win that there's less medication. As far as the primary endpoint, that was 24-hour systolic blood pressure, where there was no significant difference there, or for diastolic ambulatory blood pressure. So systolic and diastolic ambulatory blood pressure, numerically lower with renal denervation versus sham, but that difference wasn't statistically significant. On the other hand, when one looks at office systolic blood pressure or office diastolic blood pressure, there were significant reductions for renal denervation versus sham, 4.9 millimeters of mercury with the office systolic and 2 with the office diastolic. There were a number of other analyses looking at things like win ratio, for example, where the win ratio was significantly in favor of renal artery denervation, and the win ratio combined looking at the 24-hour ambulatory systolic blood pressure change greater than or equal to 5 millimeters of mercury, or a change in medication burden. I won't get into all the statistics of that, but that was very significantly in favor of things. So, a number of different analyses. Again, for the sake of time, I won't get into all of them. Primary endpoint wasn't met, but it did appear to be safe, and a number of other endpoints like office blood pressure and the win ratio were positive. And, I think some of the things that may have affected this trial, there was, COVID that was occurring, some of the way that ambulatory blood pressure was captured, given that there was a reduction in the need of medicines, might have sort of overcounted in ways that are statistically a little bit complex to explain, may have overcounted sort of that effect. That is, if you are taking more medicines in the sham control arm, well, there could be ways that when you're measuring ambulatory blood pressure, you're sort of getting a double dosing, not inadvertently, but sort of double counting the effect of those medicines. So my gut feeling is there's something here, but in the end, it doesn't really matter what I think or what we think. It really will matter what the FDA thinks.
Right. Well, there you have 4 trials. One looks at shared decision-making and atrial fibrillation. The other three looking at somewhat novel therapies for treating hypertension that offer hope for some of our patients who are so difficult to control. I really want to congratulate the trialists who do this work and those who sponsor trials like this through the tough times of COVID and economic downturns, et cetera. They're the real heroes in all of this work, as are our patients who benefit from these ongoing clinical studies. I want to thank Deepak and Payal for joining me today. This is Kim Eagle for ACC.org, and we're out.